For my nature walk, I compared walking in a city park to walking in the woods. I had a hypothesis that there would be a difference, but I had no idea what I would discover. I started my experiment as I walked to the park. I was 8 blocks away from Standish Park. During the walk through the city, I realized that I had never stopped to take in the environment. The cracked sidewalks, the brick buildings, the smell of cars and businesses had all been masked from my mind by the concern of what other people were doing around me. This made the impact of the park more sudden than it was of the woods. Before I had even entered the park, the smell of the city gave way to the smell of trees. This is why I go to the park to do homework. Even though I'd been to the park several times before, this was only the second time I had walked in the grass. Normally, I would stay in the path and sit on the bench. As I walked around in the grass, looking at the trees, a 12 o'clock church bell was rang. This pulled me away from the nature. I found that the rustling of the leaves had made it possible for me to ignore the traffic, but I still had to focus to do so. Besides the bell, the biggest distraction from nature was the people around me. No rustling of the leaves could hide their presence. I felt like they were judging me for not staying on the concrete paths. I was being oppressed by a sense of solitude. Unlike Thoreau, I am not used to solitude, but as my walk went on, I got used to it and was able to ignore the people around me to focus on nature. Standish Park has a purpose. It is a form of art with the trees planted by humans to show off their numerous different types. The first time I walked off the path in Standish was to study the trees for a high school agriculture project. Back then, I was only using the park for its purpose. I now realize how many trees I had ignored because they were not on my list to study. Now I was appreciating everything in the park. All of the trees in their unique bends, the leaves, even clovers growing in the grass, and the wind. On a cold October day, I thought the wind would have been a problem, but it was enjoyable to be in. One final contrast between the city and this park is the shade. The shade of the buildings, even when they blocked the wind, felt cold and unwelcoming. I felt like I could only stay there for a moment. The shade of the trees was more welcoming. It was actually nicer to stand in the shade than it was to stand in the sunshine. When I walked away from the park, I felt the restrictions of the city once again. Whatever freedom of thought I had in the park was gone, now that I had to pay attention to the traffic and other people as I walked. A day after going to Standish, I went to my friend's woods for a second nature walk. When I began my walk, I was only using my outward senses. This caused a bit of a shock, because at Standish, each tree was unique to the park, and most of them were large. But here in the woods, most of the trees were the same type, and nearly all of them were tall and skinny. After a few minutes, I began to use my inward senses. Once this began, I started to receive the same ministry that I had received in the park, although the woods brought this message more strongly. What was also different was moving around. The park was made for people to move through. That was its purpose. But these woods have a different purpose. I can tell because of how hard it was to move around. In the woods, many things blocked my way. The trees which grew closer together, dead logs that had fallen, and briars filled nearly every other place. To add to this, the ground had steep hills to climb down and back up on the other side. In the park, nature conformed to where I wanted to go. No place in the park was out of my access. But here in the woods, I had to conform to nature, moving under briar bushes, going around trees, and climbing over rotten logs. I felt free from my daily routine in both the park and the woods. However, the rough terrain of the woods allowed me to do this without having to focus as hard since I was focusing on where I was walking. I was able to more vividly hear the rustling of the leaves since I was no longer using them to drown out the city. Once I had been walking for a while, I became concerned that I was no longer on my friend's property and had crossed over to the neighbor's land. In order to wash my hands of trespassing, I headed to a place that I knew was my friend's property. After climbing down a hill, I returned to a state of childlike wonder. The rain had caused the stream to flow fairly strong. It reminded me of playing in the stream when I was a kid. I wanted to follow the stream, but thorn bushes blocked the way and I had to turn around. As I headed back up the hill, I noticed deer tracks on the path. In a way, I was taking advantage of these deer, since they had cleared a path through the thorns that I was now using. The biggest takeaway from this walk was when I was crossing a log. Normally, I would cross the log carefully in order to protect myself from falling. However, I found that I was more concerned about preserving nature than I was of falling. Since the woods are more natural, I found that I did not want to change them, but this never crossed my mind when I was in Standish Park. After taking both nature walks, I feel that the woods provided a much more fulfilling time. Despite how much of a hassle it was to move around, I ended up having a better time in the woods.